All right, we are going to go ahead and get started so that we stay on time. Welcome to the American Philosophical Society. My name is Michelle McDonald. I am the director of the library and museum, and I want to thank you all for making it through what is not the most hospitable of climates at the moment to join us this afternoon. Before I begin the official welcome, however, I want to review our land acknowledgement, which we do at the beginning of every program. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape people. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. So, how many of you have not been to the APS before? A few of you. Raise your hands high. That's okay. There's no shame. How many of you have been to the APS before? Right. How many of you are employed by the APS? You're all up here. I know. They all went to the balcony. I don't know why. Yes, and a couple of you intrepid people down here. So first of all, thank you to all of you who have chosen to join us in person during this afternoon of biblical rain. For those of you who are online, congratulations on staying warm and dry, but we have an excellent buffet that you are missing out on. I also have two personal pieces of information to share before I start. The first is, today is my 21st wedding anniversary. You can applaud me and my husband, who's down here in the baseball hat. The second, which some of you know but most of you probably don't, is that I'm an identical twin. My twin sister's name is Melissa. I blame her for this afternoon's debacle in terms of climate and rain. All right, so this is a very brief welcome to the American Philosophical Society. We were founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin and others who wanted to create a space where ideas and observations about the natural world could be shared and could be applied to make society a better place. I love this particular document because it starts with the first drudgery of settling the colonies, which confines the attentions of people to mere necessities, is now pretty well over, which I think is very optimistic in 1743. Nonetheless, this is when the APS came to be. We have continued to operate now more than, I can't do math in my head, 200 and many years later. We have an international membership, folks who are elected to become members of the APS because of outstanding contribution to arts, humanities, the sciences, all across the various disciplinary fields. And they gather twice a year for APS conferences in April and November. So we have one coming up in just 2 weeks. Wish us luck. We also host library and museum conferences, as well as dozens of special events like the one that you are attending today. I also want to point out and shout out the APS Press. We have the director of the APS Press right here, Kim Guinta, which has been a publishing arm of the APS really since the APS practically was founded. They publish books as well as 2 peer-reviewed journals, Transactions and Proceedings, and if you're interested in learning more, catch Kim after this talk. And then finally, in addition to creating the kind of knowledge sharing that you are participating in, we also support research throughout the world. So we awarded more than 300 research grants this year, some of which come to the APS to do research, but the vast majority of which are sent across the world. And if you ask how we do it, I will tell you that one of the ways we do it is through Friends of the APS. And so we have put on each of your tables, if you are not already a friend of the APS, information about how you can elect to do so. We have more than 14 million manuscript pages here at the APS, 325,000 books, the papers of 7 Nobel laureates, and an 8th one on promise, and I'm going to hold them to it. Scores of digital, more than scores, because the score I think is only 12, thousands of digital objects and born digital material, and our museum object collection as well, which is overseen by 4 scholarly centers here. The Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, which has just celebrated its 10th anniversary, the Center for Digital Scholarship, the David Center for the American Revolution, and your host for this afternoon's talk, the Center for the History of Science. And I would be remiss if you're looking for something else to do to stay out of the rain this afternoon. This is, what day is this? No, this is Tuesday, Thursday? Thank God, I have no idea what day it is. In that case, I can tell you that the museum is open, and our current exhibition, Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City, is on until December 28th. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, I encourage you to do so. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's program. In 2019, the American Philosophical Society's Library and Museum received the papers of two notable ufologists, Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs. Together, these still unprocessed collections document a broad network of individuals interested in exploring encounters with extraterrestrial life. Their materials also provide an important glimpse into the history behind the rise of the USO phenomenon during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and the potential to contribute to a broad range of research questions and topics in the history of science and beyond. We will be doing that today with two speakers and a moderator. Greg Eghigian is Professor of History and Bioethics at Penn State University and a former residential research fellow here at the APS. He is a historian of science and medicine and has published books and articles about the history of disability, the history of madness, the history of criminality, among other topics. More recently, he has turned his attention to the history of the world's fascination with unidentified flying objects, and his most recent book is After the Flying Saucers Came, A Global History of the UFO Phenomenon, now on display here in the front row with Adriana Link, our moderator. His next book will examine the history of alien abduction claims. Joining him is Lois Rosson, a historian of science and technology based in Los Angeles, where she writes about the visual culture of space science. Her next project examines the history of the search for life in the universe and its reverberations throughout popular culture. She has held the Guggenheim Predoctoral Fellowship at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, the Octavia E. Butler Fellowship at the Huntington Library, and her work has been supported by the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, the Berggruen Institute, the University of California at Berkeley, the University of Southern California, and the American Philosophical Society. Moderating this discussion will be Adriana Link, who is our curator for the history of science here at the APS, heading up that Center for the History of Science, who herself holds a PhD in that field from Johns Hopkins University. Please join me in welcoming all three of them to the stage.
All right, as we get ourselves on stage here. All right, so we have just under an hour to microphone would help. Thank you. You'd think after years of doing this, I would know to use a microphone. Thanks so much, Michelle, and everyone for being here. We don't have a whole lot of time for our program, so we'll try to get right to it. So some of you here might be wondering, why is the APS hosting a program about the history of UFOs? You may be thinking to yourself, where do flying saucers fit in an institution that was founded in the 18th century by Benjamin Franklin? But as I hope this discussion will show, the types of research questions and methods that drive the work of men like Franklin have more in common with recent efforts to understand and explain extraterrestrial encounters than we may realize. And I'm really excited today to be in conversation with Greg and Lois, two historians of science who have done a lot of work and thinking about this topic. And I think my colleagues here know that every time we have an opportunity to brainstorm potential exhibition topics, I always joke that my dream exhibition is from Franklin to flying saucers. So that's it. That's the joke of the day. So before I turn things over to Greg and Lois, I will note that this program today is part of an ongoing effort here to understand the broad research value of two sets of collections that, as Michelle mentioned, were donated here in 2019. And these are the papers of ufologists Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, who was a historian here in Philadelphia at Temple University. So I'll say, too, that this project is the first step in making these materials available to researchers. They are not yet open, so you'll have to wait a little bit to come back and use them, but we hope that that'll be about a year or so until they're available. And part of our efforts to kind of underscore their scholarly significance while also taking account a lot of the kind of particular nature of these materials and how to protect the privacy and the experiences of folks who were in conversation with Hopkins and Jacobs during their careers. So we're really thinking about all of these questions, both the ethical considerations as well as the broad research value. But you know, it's not an accident that they ended up here at the APS. And, I think as Greg and Lois will talk more, there are a number of collections here, some of which Jacobs himself used in his own research that do document some of this early history of the UFO phenomenon. So as you're thinking about, well, how does this kind of relate to the broader mission of the history of the APS, there is a track record here, and it does kind of continue to build a story about how we think about questions around explaining unidentified phenomenon, explaining people's experiences, and some of those human stories. But I think more critically, these collections speak to some of the broader questions and themes about the processes of knowledge making and the relationship between science and society that are really at the core of the mission of the Center for the History of Science and what we're trying to do, not just with these types of materials, but all of the collections that are housed here at the APS. So I don't want to say too much more because, spoilers, we've got a lot to talk about. So with that, I know, Greg, you unfortunately haven't had much of an opportunity to dig in the Hopkins and Jacobs papers, but you did have a chance to use some of the other collections that are listed here for this book. So maybe you could just kind of get us started today to talk a little bit about that research and some of what you've learned about the history of the UFO phenomenon. And I will hand you this clicker so that you can control your own slides.
Thank you. All right, I think I understand how this works. Yes. Well, thanks again for having me. I love talking about this topic. So the thing to start with is, of course, when you bring up the topic of UFOs, you start thinking about flying saucers and the shape of these things and aliens and all. I think for a historian, though, a historian of science and medicine, this is actually what struck me first, is how for decades we've been living with all sorts of visions of the significance of UFOs, extraterrestrial life, the possibilities of extraterrestrial visitors, ancient astronauts, things like this. This is something that has a very human side. We've been preoccupied with this topic for decades. And that, to me, was what I really wanted to study, and I thought was important to study, because really, the last historian who wrote a book about UFOs was David Jacobs, and it was published in 1975, and for those of us who have gray hair like me, we know a lot has happened since 1975. So I thought it might be time to revisit this issue. It all began, the story goes, right, with this man, Kenneth Arnold, and his sighting when he was flying his private plane around Mount Rainier in June of 1947, right? He sees these 9 objects that appear not to have really a fuselage. They just sort of look like a bat, that are flying in formation at very high speeds. He lands, he reports it to the news media, he reports it to the Air Force. People keep interviewing him about it, and he says he never uses the term flying saucer. What he says is these things moved as if you were skipping a saucer over water, and a very enterprising journalist knew a headline when they made one up, called them flying saucers, and then they became flying saucers. And within 6 weeks, Gallup poll does a survey and finds out within 6 weeks, 9 out of 10 Americans had heard the term flying saucer. So it's well before the internet, it becomes a meme. A year later, Gallup starts asking people, what do you think these things are? And this, to me, is one of the more fascinating aspects of this. It's the questions that get asked, not the answers, but the questions. And I think there's 2 things that strike me right away from this poll. First of all, what don't you see? You don't see aliens, right? If people thought they were aliens, they're buried somewhere in that that data. The other thing that strikes me is the large number of people say, I don't know. I think that's the other fascinating part, is the sense that people didn't know. So people started to speculate what happened, what's going on. So what made this flying saucer era kind of different and special? I think there's a number of things. I think, first of all, the way these things were described as saucer-like. I think this idea that the origins of these things were extraterrestrial. The context, the Cold War and space exploration, all play a big role that maybe we'll be talking about. But I think for me, it was the reactions to these sightings. The first thing is that really is quite remarkable is the extent to which worldwide governments get very interested in this stuff. This stuff was, when it breaks in 1947, is immediately seen by particularly the US Air Force as a national security issue. And it still to this very day is, with this new organization called AARO that looks at UFO reports, now called UAP, Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena. So you have the interest of the government interested in these things, but you also have all sorts of journalists who get interested. And these two figures here, at the top, Donald Kehoe, at the bottom, Frank Scully, who published books in 1950 in which basically they're the first to lay out this idea that these are aliens who are visiting us. The government knows about this and is keeping it secret, and it seems to be the case that they have captured some of these flying saucers and even have the corpses of some of the aliens involved. They're the ones who coin all this, and this becomes sort of the commanding narrative that is going to make its rounds to this very day. But the other reaction is lots and lots of just everyday normal folks like you and me who are just fascinated with the topic and are not satisfied with just reading about it in the newspapers. They want to talk about it with other people. They want to meet with other people. They want to investigate cases themselves. This is the birth of ufology. And then the other thing, of course, it gives birth to are people who sit there and go, there's something wrong with this whole story. People need to look more critically at it. You get the emergence of the first generations of debunkers, of skeptics, of academics and non-academics, people like Donald Menzel, whose papers are here at the APS, Philip Klass, a reporter and journalist who's trained, I think, in engineering, if I'm not mistaken. Carl Sagan, the astronomer, was also a skeptic. So skepticism is one of the reactions. But the other thing that emerges in the 1950s, starting in the 1950s, is also people who say, I've actually not just seen a UFO, I've actually met the inhabitants, the occupants, and they are aliens. This fellow here on the left is George Adamski, who is not very famous today, but he was very famous in the 1950s and 60s, who said that this fellow here, Orthon, is the person he met who was an alien, who were very nice, very beneficent, very generous, and very beautiful, he commented on. But very different was this couple, Betty and Barney Hill, who in the early part of the 1960s said that they were taken aboard against their will, examined, prodded by the aliens. And this began the whole narrative of the whole idea of aliens coming to abduct people. So this kind of is the general history, I think, that leads up to the kinds of things that I know Lois has been involved with.
Well, that seems a great place to segue. So Lois, I think, a lot of what you've been looking at in the Hopkins and Jacobs papers really picks up from the story that Greg has detailed in this book. So, I mentioned Hopkins and Jacobs, but I haven't really talked at all about what's in those papers. Can you give us a little bit more about their background, who they were, and talk about some of the things that you found in the archive and maybe how you're seeing its potential use for researchers, not just in the history of science, but broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am trained as a historian of science and technology, and I write primarily about space and planetary science. And when the APS first approached me about this project, I was immediately so fascinated by it because in the dominant literature in the history of space and planetary science, this is actually not a topic that gets a lot of attention. And the more you start to press, the more conspicuous of an absence it becomes, right? Because you have, especially in the 1960s, you have this moment where contactees and people who are a part of the community that Greg was just outlining, and astronomers interested in using radio astronomy to make contact with extraterrestrial life elsewhere in the universe are all pointing to the fact that the statistical likelihood that we're alone in the universe is so improbable, right? And so, I really think about, the types of histories of astronomy that I'm really familiar with, and the type of the history that Greg has outlined so beautifully, both in his book and a little bit here, right? As being an investigation of the same question, is there life in the universe, but from like two different cinematic universes, right? Where like the literature doesn't acknowledge that there's a ton of overlap, but the more you start digging into it, there absolutely is. And so, I think that for me, one of the things that was so immediately fascinating about this archive, and Adriana and I have talked about this at length, is just the size of it, right? I think that, when I was being trained, right, like I obviously was aware of, narratives about UFO sightings and then, abduction narratives, but I think that this language of like pseudoscience and fringe for me had the effect of painting it as something that was precisely both of those things, right? Something that was like, that represented like this small, like idiosyncratic minority of people. But being in the archive, we saw a photo of, boxes where these types of materials are held. It's so easy to be overwhelmed by just the material footprint of the amount of letters that both Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs received. And I think that the volume of this archive is so profound and is going to be so useful for researchers who come to work with this material. It's everything from audio recordings of people who claim to have been abducted. These interviews are often very intimate, they're emotional. One of the techniques that Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs really helped to concretize methodologically was using regressive hypnosis to excavate repressed memories of traumatic abductions. And so this is where this history, in the 1980s really also starts to intersect with histories of psychology and the proliferation of psychology as like a medical service, right, that's like widely available. And so, I think that this archive is a prism of so many different things for so many different types of scholar, right? The historian of science, right, is presented with this incredible case study of how people produce truth and how people produce evidence, right? Everyone in this story was very careful to sort of think through the methodologies, right, that they were using in this process, right? I think of like, the media studies scholar, right? This is also a story about images, right, and how people decide what something alien looks like, right, and how that image gets stabilized. But then also the student of American history, right? This is also in many ways largely an archive about the politics of expertise, right? Which is something that is so present for so many of us right now. I think, the scope of the archive, the materials are very heterogeneous, and I think it's something that's gonna appeal to a lot of different types of people.
Yeah, I know we had some slides too of, so where did the clicker go? So we can, just to give people a sense of kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so this is actually one of my favorite pictures of Bud Hopkins. This is after the publication of Missing Time, which for the ufological community, that is actually not a word I say very often, ended up being pretty groundbreaking. Missing Time came out in 1981. And I, to kind of position it in the narrative that Greg just walked us through, I really see Bud Hopkins's book Missing Time as being, kind of a conceptual sequel to the Betty and Barney Hill case. So like someone like John Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey, it's about people who are abducted, and it's composed of interviews with the abductees. And in some cases, regressive hypnosis is used again to uncover hidden memories about things that no longer live on the conscious level. But the big intervention in Missing Time is that is actually precisely that, right? That the people who are featured in this book, and there's multiple of them, there's like multiple case studies that are presented, don't actually have a conscious recollection of being abducted, and that's the crucial linchpin, right? That one of the symptoms of being abducted by aliens is missing time, like the sensation. And this happens to me all the time. You're driving in your car, say you're on like a 2-hour long road trip, right? Like you get to your destination a couple more hours, like let's say it took you 5 hours to get there instead of 2, right? That would be an instance of missing time. I am prone to zoning out, so it's a sensation that I feel like I'm very familiar with. And so, really the big contribution of this book is that the abduction phenomenon constitutes what is functionally an epidemic, that many more people have been abducted by extraterrestrial visitors than are even consciously aware, right? And that lends the book a sense of urgency, right? That like, not only do we need to take this body of evidence seriously, right? But we must be doing so, it is incumbent upon us ethically to do so, because we must figure out a way to intervene. And I included these images it's just to, try to, picture the iceberg in some way, right? Like I remember the first box of letters that I opened up, just opening it and just being like, I would need a year to go through and read all of these, right? And a lot of times they're long letters. They're long letters. A lot of them are handwritten. They detail very intimate experiences. And the tone of very many of them is, I had this thing that happened to me that I cannot explain, and I saw that you were working on this, and so I wanted to send you a letter because I really wanted somebody to tell who would take it seriously. A lot of them want to remain anonymous. They're not actually interested in like emerging as a face of the phenomenon. But they had this thing that they couldn't explain. So yeah.
No, I think that raises a really important point that I think, Greg, you bring up in your book, in that there's no one voice that's really shaping this narrative or this story. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit more, and kind of thinking about it in this question of the relationship between expertise and skepticism. So, can we talk a little bit more about who are the people who are involved in this conversation? What does that feedback loop look like? How is it specific to the kind of broader history of ufology and abduction narratives? And what does it kind of tell us more generally about the ways that we're approaching the history of science and the writing of the history of science? I know, Greg, you've written a lot about the history of psychiatry too, and there's definitely resonances there. So feel free to pick up whatever of that you'd like.
Oh, but it's a big topic. It's interesting. Yes. So when you look at, again, the decades-long preoccupation with UFOs, extraterrestrial visitors, and then alien abduction, which becomes extremely prominent starting in the 80s because of Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs and others. You do see people from all walks of life sort of getting involved and wanting to play a role in that conversation. I think one of the things that strikes me, I've always said, I found in many ways the most fascinating period of time in the history of the world's preoccupation with this subject is the period from about 1947 to 1950, those first 3 years, because what you see is genuinely people at a loss for what the heck is going on here. And that includes government officials who are scratching their heads and they're thinking, really, I mean, every option is on the table, and there's no sort of fixed way of thinking about it. There's no overriding narrative that is out there for people to latch onto. And so people are really, like I say, sort of leading and ending up with question marks. And so that opens up this field. I've always said that the thing about the UFO phenomenon is it has essentially been always seen as a mystery, a kind of a black box. And because of that, it's an invitation. And from the get-go, the invitation is you can not only learn about it and think about it, you're invited at the table. Mm-hmm. There's nobody who says you can't attend a ufology conference and become one of the people who investigates this stuff. Join our group, or join that group, or find the group you want to join. So we see a lot of different folks over the decades who are interested. And one of the things that is very true about the UFO phenomenon is you will see an overrepresentation, a disproportionately large number of people who have joined groups and become part of groups and get involved in this have serious science and engineering education. These are people who have backgrounds. This is a field and an area that has attracted people who typically have things like PhDs, right? Who have MDs and things like that. So this is a field that has attracted those kinds of folks. The other part of it is this question, though, about, as you say, expertise. Who gets to be the expert about this? I remember, I talk about it in my book, Bud Hopkins got involved in a big debate at one point during his career in the 80s with a psychotherapist who was also working with some of these people. And she said, you know, I've got a problem with people like you doing this work because you're not a trained psychologist. You're not trained in this field. You're not a clinician. You don't have malpractice insurance, right? What happens when you do some damage to the people you're talking with? Who's going to sue you, and how do they sue you? And his response to this was, who's an expert in the field of alien abduction? This is a completely new phenomenon. There's no such thing as one qualification for it. So even though he himself, his background, as you know, was an artist, he was an artist, very talented artist, by the way, you get this kind of open question throughout this about who gets to speak for whom, who gets to intervene in these things as an expert.
And I also just feel like now, because these questions are so fraught, now is such an interesting moment to revisit some of these stories, right? Because, you know, obviously, you know, we defer to medical professionals for very good reasons, right? But there is a kernel, I think, that it resonates with many people in Bud Hopkins's critique of healthcare, right? That, you know, people don't feel seen by these systems, right? Or they feel like their concerns are invalidated or not taken seriously. Also, the vast majority of the people that Bud Hopkins worked with were women. And, you know, so I think that, you know, this question of, you know, like what counts as, you know, to invoke like a courtroom analogy, right? Like what counts as admissible evidence when you're trying to like make sense of a particular moment is a really fascinating one. One of the most thought-provoking events that is well documented in this archive was the production of a PBS documentary in 1996. Greg, I think we've talked about this, but it was a Nova. I don't know if you guys remember Nova. It was like a science forward made for TV documentary, and one of the PBS producers out of a station in Boston wanted to make one about the abduction phenomenon, right? And so initially, she got Bud Hopkins, she got John Mack, who was a later collaborator, you know, who taught in Harvard's medical school. So he was credentialed in this way that we are typically deferential to, but who, you know, was also working with abductees. And so it was Bud Hopkins and John Mack sort of like making the case for why we should take abduction narratives seriously, opposite Carl Sagan and Elizabeth Loftus. So Carl Sagan famously, you know, an astronomer very interested in the search for life in the universe. And Elizabeth Loftus is so interesting. So Elizabeth Loftus was a psychologist who got famous in 1995 for a study that she conducted called the Lost in the Mall study, where she had like 24 participants and interviewed them about different like childhood memories that they had. And then like over the course of the interviews, like injected a false memory of this person as a child being lost in the mall. And she was included in this documentary to basically make the claim that that the chief explanation for this phenomenon was that people like Bud Hopkins and John Mack and David Jacobs were causing real harm by functionally implanting these memories into the minds of the psychologically vulnerable. And, you know, a very valid criticism, and this is why I say this was one of the most thought-provoking moments that I encountered in this archive, I think, period, was that what, the counter-criticism that Bud Hopkins and John Mack came back at Loftus with was that her work became extremely useful in legal cases defending sexual abusers. And in 2020, Elizabeth Loftus actually, it was like a psychological defense circuit where she spoke as an expert in the defense, for the defense in the trials of Harvey Weinstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, because her work was really useful to discredit memories of people who felt like they had survived abuse, right? And so, and this kind of gets back to your initial question, which was about, evidence and who do we take seriously, right? I think that, like, for me, one of the most fascinating aspects of this was, like, how, in like a post-Me Too movement, right? So much of the discussion around, retributive justice after someone is abused, right, is about privileging firsthand testimony, right? That, like, taking what people say was their experience compassionately and weightily, right? Part of the problem with prosecuting sexual abuse, right, is the fact that, it exists in this arena that doesn't produce a lot of concrete evidence often. And so and of course, right, like the types of things we were talking about with Me Too versus, narratives about alien abduction, right, like those are distinct circumstances, right? Like those are not one-to-one comparisons, but I think that a lot of the questions that they provoke about whose testimony does get included when we try to determine the truth of a moment, right, or an instance, I think that the questions are really similar.
So since we've sort of brought it into the present day, too, I'm kind of curious to think together about the periodization that gets ascribed to how we talk about the history of interest in UFOs. And it seems, Greg, in your book and from our conversations about the Hopkins and Jacobs material, that there's sort of ebbs and flows in kind of the public interest in exploring these types of topics and where it gains kind of traction and moments when it doesn't. And I'd be curious to hear you both kind of reflect on sort of the obvious ones. There's this kind of post-war anxiety in the Cold War moment, this desire to manage the kind of public through the military-industrial complex, all of that narrative. But I think that there's some other points along the way that also kind of help create a resurgence in these kinds of questions and modes of investigation, and of course the media being one part of that. So maybe can we think together about that? What that periodization means, what it looks like, what's sort of driving it, and maybe what are some of the larger takeaways from that? And maybe Greg, you can get us started.
Yeah. Well, let me maybe just focus on the whole alien contact phenomenon. That, since we're dealing with these papers, there's something really intriguing to me as a historian, and was one of the first questions I started to have to grapple with. And I will say I'm still sort of grappling with it, which is, the case that becomes pretty famous for alien abduction is this 1961 case of Betty and Barney Hill. And a best-selling book is written about it 5 years later by a journalist by the name of Fuller. It is really well known. People, it's turned into a movie in the 1970s, yeah. But here's the interesting thing. You would think that when this takes place, and this is a bestseller, if this is all simply can be explained as, well, something gets publicized, and now the floodgates are open, all sorts of people are going to say, that's me, that's me, that's me. The interesting thing is you don't see that happen. It doesn't happen for 20 years, right? It's Bud Hopkins who brings this up, and then it takes off in the 80s, and then you start to see people talk about it. There was under the surface in the UFO world, you have to go through the archives of the UFO world. They were talking about strange cases of weird things happening to people that left them very uncomfortable and all. But these things did not crack the mainstream media, and they certainly didn't see a kind of a explosion of people coming forward saying, saying this happened to me. So you've got a really interesting historical question to ask, which is, why is there a 20-year lag until this thing then breaks wide open, right? There's something going on for a historian to answer and address there about that. So I think in part it gets at that. The other thing that to me is really intriguing is, because I think you're quite right, Lois, there is a reason to compare this phenomenon of alien abduction to the claims and the crimes of people who have been sexually abused, in part because of the fact that the vast majority of people who claim to have been abducted come away with a sense of being traumatized, a feeling of being violated. What's equally interesting is John Mack, the doctor, the psychiatrist at Harvard who studied these people and worked with these folks, but also other researchers have since found, is that the vast majority of these people who have had these kind of experiences, most of them say they would not have it any other way. that this experience has been extremely painful, extremely traumatic, and I'm so glad this has happened to me. I've learned something really valuable, or I feel like I am on the verge of self-discovery about something. Also, something really, I think, important to sort of keep in mind is that one can't just simply explain these things in, I think, a simple model of, well, this stuff reflects the kind of paranoia of a particular historical zeitgeist, right? That something else is going on that needs to be explained. And this is where we need the contributions of religious studies scholars, psychologists, sociologists, you name it. We can go down the list, anthropologists, people who've done this kind of work before. And so there's still very much a lot more to learn. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And the other thing too that I want to add to that, Greg, is that one of the things that's so interesting to me about thinking about the intervention, right, that Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs make in this story, right, is one of their primary contributions, right, is that extraterrestrial abduction is nefarious in nature, right? That these people are being violated. This is not a positive force, right? And that's not something that everyone in the community necessarily agrees with. I pulled this slide up because you started talking about the interrupted journey. This image that's on the top is a still from a 1975 for TV adaptation called The UFO Incident, which is an adaptation of the Betty and Barney Hill story, which stars, actually, does anybody recognize who that is in front? That is a young pre-Star Wars James Earl Jones. Yeah.
He's absolutely fabulous in it. They both are.
They both are. So that's Estelle Parsons. I think the caliber of the acting is a little bit lopsided. I think that James Earl Jones got this like Shakespearean gravitas that is a little unfair to Estelle. But part of the reason why I included this slide is because one of the things that I am really interested in, right, is like, and I mentioned this in my opening comments, right, but like how we stabilize, like why is it that like the alien is such a stable character, right, like in like American folklore, right? And I think that one of the advantages of this archive, right, is that it allows you to go straight to the source material, and straight to the source material. By straight to the source material, I mean people who claim to have interacted, right, with these entities. And so the top image is from the UFO Incident, this adaptation to the Betty and Barney Hill case, and then the bottom is still of like the big reveal at the end of Close Encounters of a Third Kind, which is from 1977. And this, I think, is a really interesting moment too, because apparently the design for the aliens, like initially they were kind of insect-like looking. But then Steven Spielberg was like, it's a little bit too scary. Like, I don't want the aliens to seem like a malevolent force. I want them to be something that we can be really curious about, right? And so they ended up with this, like, sort of more childlike appearance. and this film intersects with this narrative in like a couple different ways. J. Allen Hynek, who wrote the introduction to David Jacobs's book, the UFO Controversy in America in the 70s, was a scientific advisor to this film, as was Jack's valet, though I think in a slightly less formal capacity. And so, okay, all right, so here I'm gonna get down into like the nitty gritty of the chronology because I'm a historian and I like cannot resist that. This film comes out in 1977, December of 1977. Missing Time comes out in 1981. In 1983, a couple years afterwards, Bud Hopkins receives a letter from a woman whose pseudonym is Kathy Davis, who then becomes the subject of his 1987 book, Intruders. And Bud Hopkins spends a lot of time in this book assuaging the fears of the reader that at the time that Kathy Davis had her strange dreams that he argues were the product of alien abduction, that she had not seen this film. He does this in Missing Time too, right? Like preserving the purity, right? Like of the people who he is talking to. The transcripts tell a different, more complicated story that Kathy Davis actually kind of couldn't remember. She remembers seeing the movie with her dad, who took them to go see it in theaters at around Christmas time, which is consistent with having seen it in December of 1977, which predates the encounters that she said that she then had. So that's my nitty-gritty chronology. Again, just to say that, among the numerous, incredible things that I think this archive is poised to illustrate for us, right? I think being able to go back to like what the abductees actually said, right, is of tremendous importance.
Yeah, so I do want to make sure we have some time for questions, but I do want to end. On this point, and that's to give each of you a chance to think about, what are some of the ethical considerations in using this material? I mean, we've connected it to a number of other topics that also have similar, similar stakes. So what are some of the considerations? And then, how might this set of materials also help us think about things that are happening now in space exploration, habitable worlds, interest in exoplanets? I mean, there's kind of a future orientation to this too. So those are two different questions. I will give you each 30 seconds to respond.
Let me talk about the ethical implications of all this in 28 seconds now. It's a big topic, and the ethical situations, questions come up on two sides. One is working with this archive. The researcher who comes to this is material, as we were talking about earlier actually amongst ourselves. This is analogous to looking at records that I've done over my career, at looking at like hospital records. These are people who are not just sharing stories among friends. These are people talking about, vulnerable people talking about very, very personal traumas in their lives, lots of details about things involving not just them, but other family members. This is not something that I think is that can be handled in a way as if you were walking into an archive reading the letters of Benjamin Franklin, right? It's very, very different. Also because in some cases many of these people are still alive, and so you have to walk very, very gingerly, I think, in dealing with that. The other part of it is looking at the work that these two men did. Let's be really honest. They were controversial figures in their time. And that controversy was very public, and there were a lot of people asking a lot of questions about how they were working, as I pointed out. And so the ethical questions that were raised by the work that they're doing is not just stuff that we might now today in retrospect raise. It was raised at the time. And I think that's part of the history. That's part of the history, and you've got to write that part of the history as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe I'll tackle exoplanets in my 29 seconds. So the other fascinating thing about this, and this I'm going to file under why now is a really great time to be revisiting this material, is the other thing that's happening concurrently alongside this is also like a mushrooming interest in life in the universe at NASA. I mentioned radio astronomy and Frank Drake and Drake's equation already, right? But that the use of radio astronomy to search for signs of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe is institutionalized in the 1970s under NASA, right? Like it becomes like a formal part of NASA's scientific portfolio, right? And so that's just a change in the 1980s, partially because we get better at detecting objects in other solar systems. So by the mid-1980s, we're pretty sure we've detected like a protoplanetary disk in another solar system. So like all of the ingredients that would form another planet. But we don't, and this actually blew my mind the first time that I learned this. We did not actually confirm the existence of an exoplanet, like a planet in another solar system orbiting a sun that is not our own, until 1995. This is an extremely recent history. And, after the discovery of this exoplanet, right, NASA got really serious about what we now are calling astrobiology, right? Like, what are the ingredients for life in the universe? And so, I am just endlessly fascinated, right, again, by the fact that, like, all of these conversations are happening simultaneously, right? And again, and I said this already, but if you look hard enough, there is overlap, right? One of the most fascinating characters to me in this whole story is Carl Sagan, right? Who, at this is simultaneously like the most woo of all of the astronomers, but also emerges as a passionate debunker of UFOs and alien abduction, right? And, one of the most interesting letters that I found in the archive was from a member of the Intruders Foundation, and he expressed, like, he was, like, shocked, and he felt betrayed that the same Carl Sagan who wrote Contact would not, in his words, or in his approach, be more open-minded, right, to the idea of extraterrestrial visitation, right? Like, I think, were Carl Sagan here right now, like what he would say, right, is that the standards of evidence, right, are very different in terms of, the physical likelihood, right, of actual, like, literal extraterrestrial visitors. And those are the types of questions that we're now grappling with, as we search for habitable conditions on other planets. So, yeah.
And I would be remiss to not mention that Barry Blumberg, who is president of the APS and also the first head of the Astrobiology Institute, his papers are also here, so there's another connection. So I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. Sorry, we had a lot to talk about. I'll let my colleagues on the floor, go for it.
One of your slides showed a lot of government studies. Did any of them come to conclusions? And is there a consensus of conclusions?
I would say that the general conclusion, almost all government investigations, has been that they saw and see no evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. The problem, of course, is that many people don't believe that. And that is rooted in something quite real, which is that in all those cases you saw, with I think almost no exceptions, the French, Japin is probably the only exception. Most government agencies who've studied UFOs and investigated UFOs have been military. It's been defense ministries, air forces, things like that. Nowadays, the U.S. Navy has been deeply involved. So they're concerned with national security issues, which means lots and lots of information are being kept for the public. As one investigator, one government official said to me once, the issue is not that when I keep something secret about UFOs, it's not that I'm trying to keep secret what we discovered about a UFO. I'm trying to keep secret from enemies of America the technologies we have to surveil and to detect UFOs. I don't want them to know how we know what we know, right? So, but there's no question that the vast majority of these government agencies, with the exception of some people in Japin in France, have concluded that there is no evidence of extraterrestrial visitors.
Hi, I have a question with kind of the chronology of the public imagination, like canon of what a UFO is. At what point did things go from there are these saucers in the air to the saucers come from outer space to the saucers come from outer space containing life forms visiting us? Like, how did those all get connected?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the points that Greg makes so beautifully in his book, right, again, is that there's a lot of different inputs, and I think that one of the things that's so frustrating about this history is that sometimes when you arrive at a nice tidy periodization, you learn of a couple outlier cases that just completely disrupt it wholesale. And I think that for me at least, one of the things that is, when you zoom way out, at the 30,000 foot level, right, what in my mind is a pendulum swing, right, of the post Kenneth Arnold flying saucer craze where the extraterrestrial encounter is about seeing something really far away and you're kind of seeing it in the distance. It's really visually ambiguous. I did include the McMinnville photograph because I am endlessly fascinated for reasons that I think we won't have time to get into. But then, there's this pivot in the 1980s about the, to this psychosexual invasion, I'm being abducted from my bedroom, right? I'm going into the interior of a ship, right? It's a really radically different type of experience. And we seem kind of to and I said pendulum swing because we kind of seem to be in a moment where it's once again about the military seeing visual anomalies, right? And I included this. So this is Luis Elizondo, who I think he describes himself as a whistleblower now, but this is an image that he displayed in one of his sort of public pleas for increased investigation, the use of resources to investigate, just to generate more information about what this phenomenon is. But so the image that he used, you can see here, this is him holding it up, and it looks like a UFO. It looks like a really strange image. But then leave it to the internet sleuths on Reddit. They found the exact location. You can see it's two. It's visual artifacts of this agricultural landscape, right? And so I am really interested in visual ambiguity, right? And what it means to try to use an image as an evidentiary claim when you're not actually sure what the image says itself. And I think that is a continuity across very many parts of this story. So that was kind of a non-answer to your question. I'll punt it, but.
So I think we are out of time.
We could do one more.
One
question,
more?
Just one.
Okay,
Relatively brief.
one more. Lucky question.
Thanks for a great talk. I was interested in your comparison to people who have this abduction viewpoint with PTSD. The medical community recognizes PTSD as a real thing. Is there any movement to sort of try to treat these folks who believe they were abducted by aliens in a similar kind of fashion, or do we just think they're, off the chart crazy or what?
Yeah, I don't know.
We both can if you want.
Yeah. I mean, this is a huge question, right? And this kind of gets back
With a brief answer.
with a brief answer. Thank you. As Greg was saying earlier, right, we can really liken these documents most closely to things like medical records, right? And one of the big questions while this organization, right, is trying to professionalize in the 1980s into something that people will take more seriously is precisely this question of okay, are we therapists? Should we be billing people, right? Is it illegal for us to charge money for these services, right? And if you asked Bud Hopkins, right, he would say that yes, we are therapists, and the skills that are needed to help someone who has been abducted are not necessarily things you can learn in medical school. So I think that was kind of his way of skirting it. If you were to ask Rima Lebo or any of the other psychologists that he sort of butted heads with, of course, they would have a really different answer. But I think, I think that your question is one that the actors in this story grappled with actually quite a bit.
Yeah, just to confirm what you're saying, I agree. The question always at the time was this balance. Hopkins, Jacobs, John Mack, they all saw themselves as investigators, but they also saw themselves as counselors. And the question always was, how do you balance those? So when John Mack, the psychiatrist at Harvard, gets in trouble at Harvard, the question that the medical school committee that's formed to investigate his case, that's the one thing they really focused on. They said, we're not sure that you were separating your investigation from the treatment of people. Those two things need to be separate. They need to be, you need to be clear that those things are separate. And that was, again, an element of the controversy. So yes, this has been an ongoing conversation for decades now about the extent to which treatment a la PTSD enters in. I make the argument in my book that, in fact, the thing that makes, I think, the alien abduction phenomenon so present, so timely, is that the PTSD diagnosis gets invented, gets developed, and publicized by the American Psychiatric Association in 1980. And the book, Bud Hopkins' book, Missing Time, comes out in 1981. And what is everybody talking about? They're saying trauma. The trauma is a real thing. Psychiatrists say it is. This is a real thing.
Well, there's clearly lots more we could talk about, and I wish we had time to do so, but unfortunately we don't. So I would encourage you to grab the book, and please join me in thanking our speakers for today's conversation.
And if you want to grab the book sooner rather than later, it is available for sale in the back of the room. So I encourage you to take a look. Thank you all for coming to the APS this afternoon, and we hope we see you at future events.